Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining this webinar to discuss corporate and investor action on water risk and the findings of Ceres' new benchmark, Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. My name is Beth Hooker and I lead the Ag Water Stewardship work at Ceres, which includes this benchmarking report, as well as our collaborative work with WWF on the Ag Water Challenge. Before we get started, though, I want to mention a few logistical matters. First, this is a Zoom webinar, and we welcome you to provide comments in the chat or Q&A function during our remarks, and then also during our roundtable discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the Ceres website in a couple of days. Today, we're going to start with an overview of our key findings from Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, and then we'll hear from some corporate leaders from Anheuser-Busch InBev and Ingredion, and from an investor from Impact Asset Management. After these remarks, which I'm really looking forward to hearing, we will have a roundtable discussion where we also welcome questions from the audience. We're very glad to have all of you gathered in this virtual setting, and we hope you find today's discussion enlightening and inspirational. Now, I know many of you have had the opportunity to review the report, but I wanted to begin by providing some high-level trends that we're seeing across the food sector in terms of water action. Ceres began analyzing the food sector's management of water risk in 2015 in light of the growing, very real threat that water scarcity and water pollution exacerbated by climate change pose to the $6 trillion industry. Food companies are among the first to feel the threat of climate change. That is because the average global temperatures and shifting weather patterns make freshwater scarcer and agricultural production even more difficult. This year, historic droughts in central and western parts of the United States have forced unprecedented water restrictions on farmers and left key reservoirs at their lowest levels ever. Just last month, California issued a drought emergency, even as intense rainfalls caused massive flooding and landslides. And new models released earlier this year from the IPCC show that these stressors will intensify over time. The disruption we saw this summer is only the beginning. The food sector is not only at risk due to water scarcity, but it's also contributing to it. Growing and processing the food we eat on a daily basis is a thirsty business, consuming more than 70% of the world's strained water resources. Agriculture is draining aquifers in many regions of the world, and meat production is one of the biggest polluters of watersheds globally. In this environment, companies and investors are realizing that water security is much more than an environmental concern. It's a financial imperative. Our analysis has shown that as of 2021, 71% of companies consider water risks as part of their major business planning activities and investment decisions, up from 58% in 2019. Despite this growing awareness, our report, which benchmarked 38 companies, shows that in general, companies are not prepared for a water-stressed world. In a moment, my colleague Catherine Isaf will provide a more in-depth view of the report with a particular focus on water management across agricultural supply chains. Recent supply chain disruptions show how vulnerable they are to unexpected changes. So building resilience in the supply chain is critical to reducing water risk. While there's still much work to be done, industry leaders such as AB InBev and Ingredion and others who scored well on the report give us reasons to be optimistic about our future. And it is clear that now is the time for all stakeholders, governments, companies, and investors to be bold and ambitious in tackling the water crisis alongside the climate crisis, creating a sustainable future for food production. So today, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our speakers. First, we will hear from my colleague, Catherine Isaf, one of the authors of the report. Catherine will provide a framing overview of Feeding Ourselves Thirsty with a particular focus on water management across agricultural supply chains. After we hear from her, we will hear from Brian Nash, Vice President of Sustainability at Ingredion. Brian will talk about setting time-bound sustainable agricultural commitments across their entire value chain, measures taken for success, as well as the importance of partnerships. Following Brian, we'll hear from Samantha Farbak, the Global Director for Water and Sustainability Operations at Anheuser-Busch InBev. Samantha will provide an overview of their water stewardship goals and their ambition to measurably improve water quality and quantity in 100% of communities living in water-stressed regions by 2025. And our remarks will be rounded out by Lisa Bouvion, Executive Director and Head of Sustainability at Impacts Asset Management. Lisa will provide an investor perspective on water risk management, particularly in the areas of portfolio management, as well as thoughts on what is holding companies back from making management changes and implementation commitments necessary to mitigate their water risk. And as I said, once we have had our remarks, we'll have a roundtable discussion where our panelists will address questions from our audience. Now I will turn the virtual mic over to Catherine.
Thank you, Beth. So as Beth just introduced, the main reflection we want to share with all of you today revolves around the key water risk management practices captured in the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty benchmark. Before we hear from Samantha and Brian on their practical experiences establishing these types of practices, I'm going to give you a quick sense of the state of play across the food and beverage industry according to this year's findings. Again, as Beth mentioned, Ceres has been running this benchmark since 2015, with 2021 being our fourth iteration. Again, we scored 38 food and beverage companies, the majority of which are located here in the United States. They represent 4 industries: agricultural products, beverage, meat processors, and packaged foods. Scoring was based on a 0 to 100 point basis, using public disclosures against 4 categories: governance, water risk assessments, water-related targets, and implementation practices, each with sub-indicators that can be seen here listed under the category names. Some notable changes were made to the methodology this year that ensured that the scores reflect the most relevant aspects of companies' water risk management and align with updates to the global standards that investors really are relying on, such as SASB and CDP. In particular, we increased the scoring weight and enhanced indicators that apply to those agricultural supply chains, which do contain the bulk of the food sector's exposure to water risks. This has also led us to deprioritize several indicators related to direct operations and manufacturing used in previous years' analyses. And a quick note on the data: we use data that was publicly disclosed prior to the R cutoff date this year of June 15th. These data include voluntary disclosures such as CDP reports, company websites, and mandatory financial statements such as annual reports and proxy statements. Now turning to the results, it is important to keep in mind when we're looking at this 100-point scale, scoring represents what we view as an approximation of the strength of key water risk management practices. It is not a statement on risk exposure, nor does it imply that a higher scorer is less exposed to water risks. Rather, that company is just being more proactive about addressing them. So how did our companies do? Average score this year was 45 out of 100 points. This is compared to the 38-point average from the previous year. Progress, obviously still a lot of room for improvement. Consistent with our previous reports, the highest scores were also claimed by packaged food and beverage companies, with Coca-Cola, as we can see there, holding our highest performance spot this year. Meat sector again had the weakest performance, although Tyson and Smithfield Foods had supply chain targets and policies that stood out as leading practices in their industry. Also similar to the past year, the ag products industry has seen the highest performance increases as a group overall. And our 2 speakers today, AB InBev and Ingredion, were 2 companies that demonstrated some of the most impressive advancements across indicators where we can view year-over-year progress. Now taking a quick look at some of the high-level trends and improvements and opportunities. Among the improvements, we found that 80% of companies had boards with explicit oversight of sustainability-related issues, the majority of which also received at least annual briefings on water issues. In terms of governance, we also saw a 60% increase in the percentage of companies that linked executive compensation to water performance. In the risk assessment category, we found that the majority of companies are now performing water risk assessments of owned operations, and many also had targets for water use reduction in their owned operations. Among implementation practices, we saw the most promising improvements related to direct support provided to farmers, such as favorable financing terms and interest-free loans. Then on that opportunity side, we see the emphasis is on water risk management related to the supply chain, where the lowest performance was found. For example, fewer than half of the companies disclosed a supplier policy that included specific expectations regarding water use and quality, while even fewer demonstrated policies that define protocols for non-compliance. And in contrast to that stronger performance seen in companies' owned operations, less than half of the companies performed robust water risk assessments that focus on their agricultural supply chains. Similarly, only a handful of companies have implemented water use reduction targets for their key growing regions. And finally, we find only a fraction of those companies that are providing incentives to farmers actually aiming that support to growers of key ingredients identified in high stress water basins. Just take a quick pause. That was a primer of our work, and I do want to take a deeper look into a few results related to those lower scoring supply chain indicators now. Building resilience in the supply chain is critical to reducing water risks, and so strong risk assessments are understandably foundational to that resilience journey of our companies. Our methodology for a robust supply chain assessment includes risks related to water quality and availability, and holds to SASB standards on disclosure of basin level data, including the percentage of agricultural products sourced from regions with high baseline water stress and the locations of those high risk areas that companies are dependent on in their supply chain. As I mentioned before, our research is showing that the vast majority of benchmark companies performed strong risk assessments of their owned operations. On the other hand, we see here that 18 or less than half of the group disclosed comparable water risk assessments focused on their agricultural supply chains. This is an increase from 2019, when only 1/3 of the companies had assessed their supply chain exposure. But again, still a lot of room for improvement. For example, even some of our top performing companies are missing comprehensive, publicly accessible lists of all high-risk basins from which they're sourcing. Our best practice examples of disclosure on this indicator come from companies like Ingredion and Unilever. Both of those companies are providing details on their methodology for identifying the percentage of their suppliers exposed to water risks in each of their sourcing regions, using tools like WRI's Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas and WWF's Water Risk Filter. Companies also disclose all their locations and percentages of crops exposed to the varying identified risks. While these assessments provide the evidence of where risks are located in company supply chain, it's really the time-bound and quantifiable water use goals, particularly those targeting suppliers, that are the scaffolding that are guiding companies to manage their identified risks. This is why in our methodology, sustainable sourcing commitments receive the most weight of all sub-indicators. These sourcing commitments should be designed to achieve measurable performance impacts on environmental and water improvements, and should strategically focus on all the company's key commodities. As you can see in this graphic, 68% of the food and beverage companies had at least one sustainable sourcing commitment, which is up from the 41% in 2015. Ag products was the strongest industry performer in this indicator, with nearly all of their companies disclosing goals aimed at sustainably sourcing their priority commodities. General Mills also had a very strong disclosure on this indicator, including a detailed strategy and sustainable definition for each sourcing target that they set for their 10 priority commodities. And there are a lot of great examples of good practice in this area that are worth reading about in our key findings and industry performance sections of the web report. So again, we are seeing that many companies are making commitments to promote practices leading to notable improvements in water quality and quantity in the field, as well as the watershed. However, shifts in cultivation practices take time and resources and pose especially management risks for the growers themselves. Once goals are set, therefore, companies can really make progress toward achieving those ambitions by supporting the farmers. This year, we found that 87% of benchmark companies provide educational support to farmers to encourage the adoption of water use practices, up from 32% in 2015. And more than half of the companies, or that 55%, provided direct financial incentives to farmers, which is up from the 11% in 2015. We are encouraged by the trend we're seeing over the years. However, we've also identified there is still a need in the scaling and strategic location of this support. Notably, only 12 companies have explicitly focused any implementation efforts, direct or indirect, on their water basins identified as high stress. Dano North America is one company that is committed to working with farmers and partners in high-risk basins of their supply chain through the series WWF and Ag Water WWF Ag Water Challenge. They're focusing on dairy feed and almonds, which represent the largest share of their global exposure to water risk. Molson Coors was also a leader in their industry, particularly in how they have scaled their direct financial incentives. In 2019, 99% of their barley farmers benefited from the Better Barley, Better Beer program to help them future-proof their crops. And now finally, we turn to collective action and policy involvement, areas that are receiving increasing attention. We have seen notable and positive progress since 2017, when just 5% of the companies had watershed protection plans, to the 42% we see this year. Of course, that still leaves over 50% of companies that do not have a plan or strategy for improving conditions of the stress basins they source from. Leading examples in this category include Coca-Cola, which conducted over 300 projects worldwide last year to restore local watersheds and help replenish equivalent amounts of water they withdrew from those same local basins. And on the policy side, only 10 companies this year were found to be consistently advocating for government action to protect water resources. Local government ownership and government-led systems change really is a call of our times, and this indicator illustrates that food companies can still do a lot more to advocate that governments advance science-based policy and regulation on water management issues. Our highlighted company for this indicator was Diageo, which has unique advocacy targets managed by their sustainable development lead, who ensures consistency in policy and lobbying activities related to their water stewardship strategy. All right, so with that, I do encourage you all to visit the web report for more trends, findings, and best practice examples. I'm going to leave us here in regards to our analysis today and turn it over to some of our industry leaders to do more of the talking. Thanks, Beth.
Great, terrific, Catherine. And I believe we have Brian Nash from Ingredion, who will tell us about some of your journey. Take it away, Brian. And thank you, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Beth. All right, let me share my screen here. Okay, can you confirm that you're seeing my screen?
Yes, I can see it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll talk a little bit about our path to water awareness, because I think it's relevant to why we are where we are today. In the first Feeding Ourselves Thirsty report, if anybody pulls that up and looks at it, Ingredion scored a 5 out of 100. So, and I distinctly remember being asked to come to our executive leadership team meeting and speak to our 5 score. And so I downloaded the assessment and went back through it myself. And when I showed up in the meeting, I don't think what they wanted to hear was what I told them, which is that we should have scored a 3. I thought that they were a little generous, and we should have been a 3. And our executive team was pretty shocked by that. And I told them, I said, well, the part of the problem is we have what I always termed iceberg sustainability. We talk about a tiny little piece that's sticking above the water and not about all the other things that we're doing. And so that led us into a conversation around disclosure, because, you know, I told them, had we actually disclosed everything we were doing, I thought we would have been closer to like a 27, which I think sat a lot better with the group. And so that really got down to the first step in improving is to measure, which we had done. And the next step was to share that information so that we could actually get feedback. So we did that. We went through an exercise to determine, I put in quotes here, key sustainability topics. When I showed up and said materiality matrix, the first thing was our CFO at the time said, what do you mean material? It's not SEC material, right? We got into a big discussion around the word material. And I told him, I don't care what you want to call it, right? Key sustainability topics. But we went through this exercise and confirmed that water is one of the most important aspects or considerations of our sustainability program for our company. And so that led us down a pathway of figuring out, okay, well, where do we have issues or concerns? And so we looked at some externally available water stress tools. A couple of them have already been named, like Aqueduct and Water Stress Tool, and then the Global Water Tool from World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And what we came to the conclusion to do is to aggregate 5 publicly available tools, 3 of them that were current stress looking, 2 of them that were future stress looking, and ranked all of our sites based on that average data, which we felt like gave us a good look at what we needed to do today, but also what was going to be critical tomorrow. And so that gave us a lot of really important information. I remember our executive team, one of the executives asking, well, when are we going to see the real list? And I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, but is this the list? What's the real list? And we're like, no, this is the list. And they were saying, well, wait, we're talking about putting some equipment in there that's water intensive. And we're talking about expanding here. We have to rethink all those things, right? Because we have to carefully consider how we expand our operations if water is critical to the particular thing that we're putting into space. And so I remember that conversation to them, me thinking in that room, that was an important kind of aha moment for our entire team, right? Is starting to think about sustainability and water in a very long-term strategic way. And then right along with that, the next step was to start to engage our agricultural supply chain in a much more meaningful way. So along with this geographic water stress information, that also gave us some insight into where there might be risk or where we might need to help future-proof the growers that we rely on for our business. So when we think about engaging with our growers, Ingredion uses the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform's Farm Sustainability Assessment. So SCI platform was founded out of the food and beverage industry. The FSA, for people who aren't familiar, is about 114 questions that give you a wide variety of information at the farm level. What was really important about this is it allowed us to benchmark grower practices. So an example I'll give you is in Pakistan, we found that a lot of our farmers were using irrigation, and that was information that we uncovered from the FSA. And a lot of them identified the availability of water as being kind of the rate limiting step in their agriculture. And so this led us to set some year-on-year improvement plans. In Pakistan, that happened to be working with growers to help fund and install drip-fed irrigation. And in other geographies, it's led to other issues. So in Brazil years ago, we found that local water streams were having agricultural chemical containers either dumped or stored in a way that they could leach into the local waterways. And so we worked with the local government and started a recycling program whereby when growers brought corn to our facility, they could also drop off their containers, which we could then make sure were appropriate to send on to the government for recycling. So that's been very successful for us. I think just delving into the data and figuring out what do we need to work on in particular areas, and then budgeting and setting improvement plans. I think what's newer for Ingredion is working on collaborating to increase scale. So over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working a lot with our customers on projects on how we can scale up some of these initiatives with growers. And the one that I'll highlight that we launched earlier this year is what we're calling our SWAF pilot project. So this was an engagement that one of our customers, PepsiCo, actually brought to us. It's being managed by an NGO called the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. And the way it works is they work with growers to adopt regenerative agriculture practices, and then they measure the outcomes of those. So the benefits of water, the carbon reductions, and then the companies involved, like Ingredion and PepsiCo, essentially purchase those outcomes. So what we're doing in essence is we're giving the growers some financial incentive, or we're helping to offset the risk of them trying those practices. And so the background you see here on this picture was actually one that I just got sent by SWAF last week as an example of one farm where they've got regen ag practices on the right and traditional practices on the left. And so in this case, that grower is trying to compare and see, what are the benefits of both ways. Okay. And so I think I'll just wrap up by saying, for us, the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty report, I think, has been a great benchmark. We started out with a little bit of egg on our face, but what we've done is we've used it as a roadmap along with other things as well, in just really trying to figure out what are the next critical steps for our company. So my last comment is to say, thanks to the series team for putting the report together, because it certainly helped drive action at Ingredion.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Brian. And I think we'll turn now to Samantha Farbak from Anheuser-Busch InBev and hear a little bit about your journey there. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you. So happy to be here. Can everyone see just the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, Sammy Farbak. I'm on the global sustainability team at AB InBev. I'm leading on our water stewardship efforts based out of New York. And like Brian, just really appreciate the work that Ceres has done with the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty benchmark, and really excited to share a bit about our approach on these topics at AB InBev. So to give just a quick bit of background, we launched our most recent set of sustainability goals in 2018 to be achieved by 2025. And Brian spoke about materiality, and we really tried to focus our goals on the areas that are most material to our business and where we felt we could have the most impact. So smart agriculture, water stewardship, circular packaging, and climate action. And I'll of course focus on those first two today. And I'll start with water stewardship, actually. And it's probably not hard to see why water stewardship matters to our business. It's the #1 ingredient in our beers. Beers are 90 to 95% water. And as innovative of a company as we are, we have not yet figured out a way to make beer without water. Of course, it's a natural resource that, as Catherine mentioned up front, is increasingly under threat. So we've invested a lot of time into understanding our specific water risk across our global footprint. We've developed a bespoke water risk assessment tool that leverages some of the publicly available tools like Aqueduct and WWF's water risk filter that have been mentioned previously. But then using those as a starting point, the tool guides our operating sites in an in-depth risk assessment across 4 dimensions of risk: water availability, quality, as well as regulatory risk and reputation risk. And so based on this, we're really taking an integrated approach to addressing our water risks, having set both internal and external targets on water. Inside the walls of our breweries, we're really focused on brewing our beers at the highest level of efficiency possible, aiming for 2.5 hectoliters of water per hectoliter of beer produced by 2025, and aiming for even greater efficiency at our breweries located in high-risk watersheds. Outside of our brewery gates is where most of my work is focused and where our 2025 water stewardship goal is focused. And that goal is that by 2025, 100% of the communities where we operate that are facing water stress will have measurable improvement in water quality and availability. And we're really proud of this focus on measurable improvement, and feel we were one of the first companies to sort of set a public commitment focused on that, because we think that when it comes to addressing the root causes of water risk and really as a company contributing to building lasting water security across our value chain, that focus on measurable improvement is really important. To achieve this goal, we've developed a 7-step watershed management process that we're implementing across our high-risk watersheds. And the process isn't anything groundbreaking, as you can see here, but we found that there has been a lot of value in its simplicity and that it's been a real valuable driver of impact across our geographic zones. So what does this look like in practice? Our teams across our zones are really catalyzing action at the local level and doing some innovative and impactful work in the watersheds where we operate. And I've highlighted a few of them here. I think for the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail, but I think we'll echo something that Brian mentioned as well, which is the importance of collaboration and collective action. The scale of the water challenges we're facing collectively are bigger than any one company or organization can tackle on its own. So we work both with local partners and as well as with global partners such as the Nature Conservancy and WWF to make progress towards our goal and towards shared goals around water security. So now I'll share a little bit more about the agricultural side of things, which is of course the big area of focus of the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty benchmark. And in the area of what we call smart agriculture, our goal is that by 2025, 100% of our direct farmers will be skilled, connected, and financially empowered. Given the scale of AB InBev, we're perhaps somewhat unique in that we source quite a significant portion of our raw agricultural materials through direct buying relationship with farmers. Around the world, we work with more than 20,000 farmers in 13 countries to secure the ingredients we need to brew our beers. This is a large part of that, of course, is barley, but also corn, hops, rice, cassava, and sorghum. And like our water stewardship goal, we feel our smart agriculture goal is somewhat unique, particularly in its focus on the farmers themselves. We have built teams and organizational structures to enable us to build strong relationships with our farmers, from agricultural researchers focused on resilient crop varieties to more than 100 agronomists around the world engaging directly with our farmers and helping them make critical decisions, including ones related to water use and efficiency. And we also systematically identify and leverage technologies that improve our connection to these farmers and help them in their capabilities to implement sustainable practices. Our smart ag goal is designed for multi-dimensional impact and to contribute to building an agricultural supply chain that's both environmentally and socially sustainable. So focused on supporting our farmers, not only in improving their productivity and their resilience, but also in contributing to building healthy ecosystems and watersheds. As has been said, about 90% of the water footprint of our beer sits in our agricultural supply chain. So we focus quite a bit on water risk and security and watershed health in our raw material sourcing programs. Our global policy on responsible sourcing principles for farms explicitly implement resources through practices such as improved irrigation efficiency and conservation agriculture. And by the way, I'm getting a little message that my internet connection is unstable. So please let me know if you can't hear me at any point. Our policy also encourages farmers to collaborate with other local stakeholders to identify and implement locally relevant water management solutions. And then on the ground, our agronomy teams are focused on working with our farmers to implement best practices and technologies around irrigation efficiency, including drip irrigation, breeding new varieties for drought tolerance and enhanced productivity in the face of climate change, and implementing ecosystem and watershed protection efforts. And finally, as I mentioned, we seek to continuously, identify, pilot, and implement innovations and technologies that will really help us not only improve, but scale these efforts even further. I saw a question in the Q&A about getting some of these initiatives to scale. And just as a couple of examples we have an internal platform called Smart Barley that helps farmers improve their productivity and sustainability practices through data and analytics. And in 2020, we made this platform even more useful to our growers by integrating it with the platform of our technology partner, Centera, who provides real-time analytics through their field agent platform. We are also using predictive analytics to do climate modeling for barley, enabling our growers to have better decision-making and better practices based on expected changes in precipitation and water availability. And then finally, through our 100 Plus Accelerator, we worked with a startup called Jibe, which combines remote sensing with satellite data to provide cost-effective and real-time monitoring of water quality to look at sedimentation in a key barley growing region in the US. So just wanted to provide a short but comprehensive overview of how we look at water risk and water stewardship at AB InBev across our value chain. It's not only the #1 ingredient in our products, but it's obviously a critical resource for the well-being of communities and ecosystems around the world. So again, really appreciate the work that Ceres is doing in this space and appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Sammy. Great to hear about all the great work you're doing, and looking forward to our discussion when we can probably delve into some of those things a little bit more. And I just want to remind our audience that we do have a Q&A function, so please feel free to put things into the Q&A. And I am delighted to welcome Lisa Bouvion from Impact Asset Management for an investor perspective. So welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure. So I'd like today to talk through a little bit around Impact's investments, how we think about water risk management, and also perhaps provide some perspectives on what is hindering companies from focusing on water and focusing on best practices around water management. But first of all, a few words about the impacts itself and how we analyze these things. So Impacts is investing in companies benefiting and enabling a transition to a more sustainable economy. We today have about $50 billion of assets under management. And a lot of these investments are in thematic environmental solutions, but also sustainable funds. ESG is fully integrated into the investment process, and it sort of touches on really 3 areas of our investment process. Firstly, in informing our investment universe, finding out those areas that are of interest and well aligned to a transition to a more sustainable economy, or providing solutions to unmet societal or environmental needs. Secondly, company level ESG analysis. And thirdly, engagement with our companies. We are long-term shareholders, and we engage and view it as a way of partnering with our companies and helping to understand more about our companies, but also helping companies to improve over time. We see a lot of companies and sort of want to see ourselves as a sort of free, friendly consultant or a critical friend, perhaps, but first and foremost, a partner. So as part of our ESG analysis, we analyze ESG and water risks. And water we view very much as both potentially an operational, but also very importantly, a strategically material area for companies. And I think it's fair to say that most companies today are water companies. Most economic activities will require water. So it's going to be highly disruptive for almost any company if water availability or water quality is somehow disrupted. And I think Brian had a really good point earlier on about materiality, and I'll come back to that point because I think it's part of why things are perhaps not evolving as quickly as we'd like within water. And I think materiality has to do with that a little bit. But in terms of our water engagement, what we try to understand is, first of all, the water exposures and also water impacts. So double materiality there, how companies are managing these risks, but also encouraging new approaches for our companies when it comes to water risk management. But I would say what has also been a real sort of real focal point for us in noting how critical water is for many of our companies is that we have developed a physical climate risk tool, a proprietary tool looking at 9 physical climate hazards. And we are analyzing companies' facilities, their plants, essentially their operations for these physical climate risk hazards. And without exception, water stress now in 10 years and 30 years time tends to be the number one issue that comes up as a risk. So it is really critical, and we engage with the companies based on this, showing what proportion of their plants and facilities may be at risk of water stress and other physical climate hazards. We have seen, for example, very concretely, some of our water utilities, for example, quite literally running out of water, perhaps not permanently, but at least at times. And often the case has been there that they are competing, for example, with hydroelectricity for the water resource, and there is a combined drought as well in place. We've also seen, for example, in the semiconductor industry, which is very water intense, some very concrete examples of water scarcity. It is, of course, something that is a daily issue for food companies as well, which is the real topic today. But I wanted to give a couple of sort of ideas of why I think what is sort of holding companies back from implementing sort of water risk management in an effective way. And I think there's quite a few reasons, actually. So first of all, I think water is very much overshadowed by climate and carbon, but at the same time, water is climate, or at least water is the casualty of climate. So I think it's incredibly important to remember that it is in many ways part and parcel with climate. Also, as for climate, the focus is within climate predominantly on carbon mitigation. It is much less on resilience, on physical climate risk, which will almost certainly dwarf the transition or policy risk of climate. It's always easier to look at issues that translate into one number, that have global, not local application like water, and that require sort of complex and messy things to measure and report, such as local context for water. Water is local. But I also think water suffers from incrementalism, and it also has been perhaps viewed too much of a compliance or perhaps a CSR approach. But it needs to be part of companies' strategy, its risk registries, and incentives. And I was very pleased to see that the report is finding that many more companies are now tying management compensation to incentives. But I think it needs to be part of company strategies properly to be priced and valued correctly. But let me come back to the point about materiality. So quite often we hear from some companies, even companies that deal with water and are providing water solutions, for example, they say, well, we're not really measuring and reporting on water because it's not material for us. I think we cannot think about water completely in that traditional sense of saying what is the most financially material for you. Firstly, because water is artificially cheap and is not priced correctly today. It is even free in some cases. That might not be the case always. So there needs to perhaps be a shadow pricing to reflect the pricing. And that might even make it financially, operationally very material if correctly priced. But I also think that all companies are basically water companies. Almost all economic activities require water. So it has really a sort of a potential to be a very broad disruption for companies. So I don't think it is really an excuse to say that water is not material. So I think we need to view water much more as a universal issue, part of physical climate risk and resilience, and hence very much part of corporate strategies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate your thoughts on that. And I think now we're at our time for a roundtable discussion with all of the panelists. So Lisa, Sammy, and Brian, if you want to start your video. And we can sort of tile up here and sort of start this. We have received some questions from the audience and also have some other questions. And I thought I would just start with a question for you, Sammy. AB InBev has recently launched your Sustainability 100 Accelerator approach in line with your 2025 sustainability agenda. And that includes consideration of key risks and opportunities for the company to consider in order to remain successful over the next 100 years. So when you launched those goals, you also, that 100 plus accelerator was part of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that approach and some of the, key challenges and exciting things that are a part of that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Beth. So as you said, the 100 Plus Accelerator has really become one of the cornerstones of our sustainability efforts, in particular our sustainability innovation efforts. In typical AB InBev fashion, when we announced our 2025 sustainability goals, we didn't have the full picture of how we would achieve them. We like to say at AB InBev that we dream big, even if we don't have all the answers yet. And so we knew we would need innovation, not just from within our own company, but from the rest of the world as well. And that we need to partner with, entrepreneurs who were trying to frankly tackle the same environmental and social challenges that we were. And so we launched our accelerator first as a means for open innovation to help us achieve our sustainability goals. So we sort of laid out on the table for the world of entrepreneurs to see what were the problems we were trying to solve in not only water stewardship, in agriculture, in the other sustainability areas that I mentioned. And then we, have this program whereby the startups that are selected get up to $100,000 to pilot their technology or innovation somewhere in our value chain to sort of prove the impact of what they're doing. And then at the end of it, there's a demo day that we host, not just with people within AB InBev, but from external investors as well, with the hopes of, for those who have successful pilots, signing a commercial agreement with that startup, and also perhaps enabling them to expand, their investment network as well. And so we've done 2 full cohorts so far, and we have started our 3rd cohort as well. And so have had some really great water startups, from operational water use efficiency to external watershed work, like I mentioned, Jibe, looking at real-time water quality monitoring, to in-home water quality testing, kind of has run the gamut. And we're really excited about the results so far, and particularly excited that for this 3rd cohort, 3 other companies that I think 2 of which at least were a part of this with the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty benchmark, Unilever, Coca-Cola, and Colgate-Palmolive have joined us in the accelerator. And I saw that there was a question about getting to scale. So again, another example of how I think collective action and collaboration can really help bring some of these innovations from the pilot phase to more widespread use and impact.
Terrific. Thanks so much for that overview, and also for, sort of addressing a little bit about, the how to scale, and thanks to the audience for that question. And just remind everybody the Q&A is available. Brian, I wanted to turn to you. As you mentioned, you've seen, some improvement, a lot of improvement in your performance on this benchmark. And I was wondering if, you could speak to the relationship you've witnessed between, progressive increase in water-related management targets and actions, and then tangible business benefits or outcomes. And you kind of touched on that a little bit in your remarks. And I'm wondering if you could share any examples of improved business resilience that have been afforded by these water management changes.
Yeah, well, I mean, to Lisa's point, water is material for us, and it was an easy conversation in our executive team, because I said, well, if we took it away, how long would we continue to operate, right? And so, the answer is not long. So I think for us, where we've seen the biggest examples of resiliency in the supply chain is where we've worked with growers. So I mentioned the drip fed irrigation in Pakistan. I want to say that increased their yield something like 38%. We've worked with some growers in Thailand on what we call a model farmer program, where we train growers in a village on different skill sets, and then they agree to work with others in that village to kind of spread that learning. And so those are places where we can't necessarily have contracts with growers. So we have to rely on kind of maintaining that business relationship and fostering it. The growers have to want to sell to us, right? It's not like the US where we can set long-term contracts. And so I think there's a mutual benefit to increasing yields, but also it helps strengthen that business relationship. And where we can't have those kind of long-term contracts, I think we need those relationships to make sure that we're continuing to get supply from sustainable sources.
Terrific. Thanks for sharing that. Lisa, I was turn to you, and I wonder if you have some tools or actions that investors really need to employ to kind of help continue to drive that progress for water conservation and water risk in this sector.
Yeah, I think it is key that investors are active on these issues, and I think active both with companies, but also standard setters, which is very key today, but also policymakers. And for example, in our engagements with companies, we would be very much sort of asking or discussing 5 fundamental issues, and the first one being around internal water governance, and very much asking for that sort of incentive tie up to management teams, but also the shadow pricing issue, because we really think that is potentially a fairly big risk there. Obviously, we're talking about water footprint data, withdrawals, and target setting, very critical there, of course. But we talk thirdly also around the so-called water handprint. So the investment into water savings, efficiency, treatment, etc. CDP had a very interesting data earlier this year showing that the sort of inaction of not investing into water solutions and water innovation might be 5 times more expensive than actual investment into these sort of innovations and methods of saving water. But the sort of fourth issue that really goes across both the water footprint and handprint is the whole issue around water context, the local water context, I should say, very importantly local. In other words, what is the local hydrological condition where water is being withdrawn, and also perhaps where the positive investments have been made. In other words, how impactful is the water saving? And fifthly and lastly, but not least at all, and this is something I think both Sammy and Brian have been talking about, is the sort of external water stewardship. So engaging with other users of water in the local watersheds, etc. That seems to be, a very effective tool. So these are the kinds of issues we are recommending for water companies, and we are engaging with them. We have a few other sort of perspectives for standard setters and policymakers, which I can share perhaps later, or can be found in our recent water impact report that we have done with AP7, a Swedish pension plan.
Great, thank you, Lisa, for that. I wonder, Sammy or Brian, if you have any responses to what Lisa has said, particularly from where you sit in your places at AB InBev and Ingredion, and particularly, in the sort of governance level and some of the challenges you may have had related to achieving those approved water-related practices and strategies.
Yeah, I think certainly there's some good wisdom in a shadow price for water, or figuring out what the true price of water is. I know that when we look at capital projects, we've changed and evolved how we do that, right? So used to be in South America, if you tried to get a couple $100,000 water recycle put on a project, people are saying, why? I don't pay anything for water. Well, you take it out of a river, you treat it so that it's food grade, you use it, you take it back out of the product, you treat it again, you put it back in the river, probably cleaner than you took it out, right? But there's a lot of cost associated with that can be minimized. And so using tools like Ecolab's Water Monetizer or whatever, even if you just pick a price, right? It still, I think, sparks the right conversations. So when we started having those conversations, I think the governance around water got a lot better in the organization.
Yeah, and I think one other thing I'll pick up on that I think may also answer one of the questions that came through in the chat was what Lisa brought up, I think, about the local water context. And, people may have noticed that in our water stewardship goal, we don't have sort of like one KPI that we're working towards in all of our watersheds, and that's deliberate. The way that our 7-step process works is that the first step is to engage local stakeholders and make sure we understand what actually are the biggest problems in the watershed in each of the different locations. And then from there, what solutions make sense for us to engage in and hopefully collaborate with others on. And that's then when we get to the point of, okay, if this is what the water problem is, and these are the activities we're going to invest in, what are the KPIs specific to that watershed that we're going to work towards on water availability or quality or access or whatever it may be. And so I think to the question in the Q&A about global data, I completely agree. And that's why we use the global data sets at AB InBev as a starting point. And then we have this in-depth questionnaire that really leverages the local knowledge of our teams on the ground using, hydrological assessments, et cetera, to say, okay, understand that this is what these tools globally say is the issue, but let's drill down and either validate it or add some color and context to that. So I just think that's been really valuable to us to not just kind of use blanket global data that doesn't really take into account all those local nuances.
Terrific. I think we have probably time for, there's a question in the chat that I thought would be great to maybe have a quick speed round from you all. Really is about the materiality gap, and the challenge related to accounting properly for water risks isn't just about how water is material for the company as a first critical step, but assessing the relevance of those water-related risks compared to other ESG issues. And, as you said, Lisa, carbon, human capital, waste, et cetera, that are often the key risk drivers. And so the question posed is, do you also see this to be a challenge from your perspectives? And would you say that once we are able to capture those risks and impacts better, the importance and relevance of water will grow exponentially among the other broader ESG issues?
Happy to jump in. I think one thing I will say is fortunate perhaps in the beverage industry that it's perhaps not as hard as in some other industries to make the case for why water is so material. Our CEO likes to say, no water, no beer. If we run out of water in the communities and watersheds where we're operating, we simply don't have a business. So it's not really an option for us to not be thinking about how we manage our own operational water use in our value chain, and water availability and quality in the communities that we're a part of. But I think you've highlighted, the person who asked this question has highlighted a really important thing that I think probably many companies have been on in this sustainability journeys, which is to think about sustainability issues in sort of siloed pillars and needing to move towards an integrated look at how all these things are interconnected. And I think rather than being a challenge, it's actually a huge opportunity. When we think about some of the things that we're doing for watershed protection, such as reforestation or ecosystem restoration and that type of thing, there are significant, carbon capture benefits to that and biodiversity benefits to that. So we're working a lot on kind of mapping the overlapping impacts of the things we're doing across our sustainability pillars and better accounting for kind of the co-benefits of all the things we're doing so that we can invest in the types of activities that actually are achieving multiple objectives at once for our company and for the communities and ecosystems that we are a part of and depend on.
I'm happy. Brian, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Just quickly, I think that's a very good question and a really relevant one. I think the future of investing in many ways is that we will be looking at a lot of factors, and as Sami said, there is so much intersectionality. Everything affects everything. So I think we have to accept that, just going it by, sort of SEC accounting and saying this is material, this isn't, we shouldn't look at that. I think that can be difficult because things are so related to each other, climate and water and biodiversity, and ultimately it is going to be about health and human capital and all of us, etc. So it is quite, it's very interconnected as well. But I think the key element that I in some ways see missing in the ESG conversation today, whether it's climate, net zero, all these things, is about resilience. And I think if there is something that is really about resilience, it is water and being able to sort of continue operations going forward. And, you know, looking at local resiliency, it doesn't map exactly the same way as sort of other ESG factors around materiality. So I think we need to think the whole time around resiliency of businesses, portfolios, etc. And again, water is key there.
You know, Brian, I don't want to cut you off, but we're right at time. And so I feel I'll have to thank everyone and ask you to, you know, follow some of the work that Ceres is doing. We have a Valuing Water initiative that really kind of gets at addressing some of those items that you've brought up. It'll build on our work from Feeding Ourselves Thirsty and the Ag Water Challenge, and really try to put that, you know, value on water. And so keep an eye out for that. It will be coming out in the new year. And certainly please visit our website. And thank you to everyone who came and to all our panelists. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts and all the great work that you're doing. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lisa.